We're going to start chapter two of Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels. And today, I just want to, because the philosophical background is so important. Last time I introduced to you, some of the ideas of Platonism, and basically Platonism, uh, beginning with Plato and carrying all up through the Middle Platonists and finally to the Neoplatonists, really suggests that there is a reality that's beyond this one that is much more stable, that is much more realistic. It doesn't disparage this world, but it also is suspicious of the idea that we can know anything of truth by observing this world. You can imagine that that doesn't do a whole lot for the scientific method. It would be Aristotle who would later come along and challenge that idea. But the Platonic tradition, especially with its understanding of emanations from a God who is understood to be the absolute reality, who emanates these forms or ideas that Plato talked about, which are the blueprints for everything that is created in this world below. And our connection to those things happens through another emanation called the world soul. So we can all have this kind of intuitive sense of the order of creation and the order of things that we observe. This was probably first established by Pythagoras, picked up by the Platonists, and later on made an important part of the Neoplatonic cosmogony, or the way the world is created. And so there's a lot that has to do with it. Remember last time we looked at the cave analogy, and I think many of the Gnostics have some affinity with that idea that that they live in a world and they have an access to reality that is akin to that of those who climb out of the cave of ignorance. And this is the important thing, really, that in the Christian tradition, especially after St. Augustine in the fifth century, early fifth century, uh, the real hindrance to achieving our full humanity was the fact that we were caught up in original sin, according to Augustine, according to orthodoxy, right? We are totally depraved, as Calvin later would say. But in Gnosticism, and this is the big debate right here, the problem isn't total depravity. It isn't this inherent sense of the inability to do anything good. The problem is ignorance. So the original sin is ignorance. And what we really need to do is draw ourselves out of that ignorance. So you can see how Plato's cave analogy really lends itself to understanding the Gnostic worldview. The Gnostics saw themselves as living in the midst of many people who were still laboring under the illusions of, the cave shadows being reality, right? When they, because of their secret knowledge that has been given to them through the teachings of Jesus, have achieved a new plateau, and thus a new plateau that rises above this world and enables them to become one with God. This idea of becoming one with God is something called theosis in the literally becoming God-like or becoming one with God, is something that still a central takes has a central place in the Eastern Orthodox tradition as well. So with that in mind, the whole Platonic tradition, especially the idea that the absolute reality rises way above this world, and it's so transcendent that we can't say anything about it, right? Because as soon as we say something about it, we create we make it an object of our intellect, right? And if it contains all things, if it is the source of all things, then there is nowhere where we can go to stand apart from it and look over there and say, hey, there's that object called the one. So to call it the one is even a misnomer. It's something you cannot say anything about. It is the source of all reality. And this is what Gnostics are aspiring to. Um, I can't remember if I mentioned this last time, but this Neoplatonic tradition is also the source of the Kabbalistic mysticism that many people are finding, very attractive today. Um, and it's also, I think this is where we left off last time. Uh, the idea of visions. Gnostics can have visions of Christ that uh, instill in them some sense, either an intuitive sense or an actual teaching that comes directly from Christ. This is what is so challenging to what we might call Orthodox Christianity, because all knowledge, it becomes esoteric instead of exoteric. The Orthodox tradition wants your knowledge to be exoteric, in other words, coming from without and preferably from the church and its doctrines. If you have a number of people who have visions and this esoteric knowledge, then it's very, very difficult to administer this group, to keep them under control, to create any kind of unity. In fact, in Gnosticism, the idea of building upon a tradition by having new creative insights into past knowledge is upheld to be the ideal. In the Orthodox tradition, as we are beginning to call the early standardized church of the second, third, and fourth century, you don't want creativity. It's only within very, very strict bounds that creativity is allowed to take place. Uh, but this idea of visions is not something that's foreign to even the Gospels or the letters of the New Testament, right? We know that Paul had visions, as in we see in 1 Corinthians 12 and Acts chapter 9. Peter had a vision. You remember the blanket with all things floating from heaven and the voice saying, "Take up and eat." So Peter was given some sort of special new knowledge about what was kosher and what was not. Uh, as well as Stephen, before he died, he had a vision of Christ. And so, and that just leaves aside all of the prophets as well. Many prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel especially, and Isaiah, were prone to visions. So it's not like the Gnostics were creating something anew, right? They were just drawing on a tradition that had the potential to disrupt the emerging Orthodox tradition. When we left off last time, I wanted to make this very important distinction because there are two types of Gnosticism. One is called monism or monadism. Well, no, what is the word that they use? Modal, no, well, monism was called that all things are one, that in this emanation from God into the world, there is no place where God is not. All things are one. Now, there are places, for example, in the deepest, most material elemental reality that are farther from God, but all things are nevertheless contained within God. That's referred to as monism. Pagels refers to it slightly differently, and I cannot recall that name right now. Uh, but there's another type of Gnosticism, which is the real problem, um, and was going to cause problems in the second century for Irenaeus and Justin and people along those lines who are trying to fight heresy. And that's something called dualism. There is a qualitative dualism, and it usually represents itself in terms of darkness versus light, matter versus spirit, and in some ways, female versus male. And so that we live in a world where there are clear distinctions between things that are really good for us and things that are really bad for us. Um, and so you can see not all forms of this dualism tend towards making of the world an evil place, but most of them do. And so I want to give you an example of two of those types of Gnostics. The first one is one that we referred to last time, and his name was Valentinus. And he he was a bishop in Rome and actually almost became the Bishop of Rome, but someone else was chosen over him. And at that point, he kind of veered off with his followers and started this new movement, already seeing that the church was starting to really put its limitations on his creative thinking, right? Valentinus claimed the tradition of Paul. He was very, very focused on the gospel, or excuse me, the epistles of Paul. And we know about Valentinus primarily from Tertullian, who opposed him. And he was one that adopted this position that in the beginning there was the one, right? And this one emanated what he referred to as eons. And through those eons, the world came into existence. And in this world in which we live, there are three types of people. There are spiritual people, there are psychic people, and there are animal people. Spiritual people are the highest order, right? They alone have the ability to achieve that transcendence and theosis, or unity with the one. The psychic people are the ones who have the ability to reason, but they are still nevertheless restrained by a certain amount of ignorance. And finally, the animal folks, they're just sheerly out after whatever they desire, right? The idea for Valentinus was that Jesus came to bring redemption to the spiritual people by giving them the key that would unlock uh, how they unlock their bodies that were bound to this physical world and rise to the one above. And for that reason, they committed a very particular heresy that would later be condemned called Docetism, that Jesus only appeared to be a physical body, because that would make him just like the spiritual people who needed redemption, right? He needed to be someone who could draw them away from their souls locked in this physical body. So Valentinus was very, very adamant that Jesus only appeared to be a human, therefore did not die on the cross, did not suffer on, I should say, did not suffer on the cross, and did not die on the cross. So that's where we were last time. That's a very, very brief overview. And but it will really be important as we move into the second chapter. Any questions about this? Or questions of clarification or points of clarification?
Dan, that must have been fascinating for the peasants. It's like, what? I've got cows to breed,
Yeah.
sheep
Well,
to
right.
sheep to breed.
And again, as I mentioned before, this is definitely a part of the Hellenistic uh, Greco-Roman society that it's you don't find it much in Judaism. You're not going to find many Gnostics in traditional Jerusalem. This was basically taking Jesus, the teacher, and assimilating him into a philosophical tradition that was already somewhat prominent in Asia Minor all the way to Rome and Greece, even in Egypt as well. And we eventually it was going to lose out. But I want you to remember Valentinus, because it's his tradition, or an aspect of his tradition, that is going to carry itself through all the way up until the 21st century as a subset, or as a minority movement in Christianity referred to as mysticism. There's a lot about what Valentinus says about achieving oneness with God that we still see today in people like Meister Eckhart and Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich. people who are not in the mainstream, but who nevertheless played a very creative and important role in the development of Christian doctrine, especially in about the 13th and 14th centuries. Um, any other comments? Well,
I'm
here,
trying to figure out how to get my video. Uh, it's just black
oh,
and
okay. That's all right, Angie. We usually those computers have a like a little button up top where you can pull it aside and it opens up your. Are you on a computer, Angie?
yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. We know that you're paying a rapt attention.
Uh,
Well,
An- Angie,
that is,
just touch that button marked video, and it should have a line through it, and that'll bring on your video.
On my laptop, it's down along the bottom lower left.
Mine too.
Yeah. Yeah.
okay.
Well, anyway, I will, if you find it, that's great, Angie. If not, please do not hesitate to jump in with your insights because um, over against Valentinus, actually, I should refer to him more accurately. The way he's referred to now is Valentinus. But over against Valentinus. Now, this is not Saint Valentine, by the way. There were many Valentinuses at this time. But this is a founder of a Gnostic movement in the second century that we've just referred to. But over against him, there was another man who is really more important and probably is not given enough credit, negative though it would be, for his influence on the development of the Christian canon, for the New Testament canon. Because Marcion of Sinope, I guess is how you say that. I'm not really sure where that is, actually. I think that's in northern Africa, Egypt, maybe, or perhaps Syria. Somebody can, I should have looked at that before I started our class today. But Marcion was a follower of Paul, actually. In fact, the article that Denny sent out, that I will send to all of you, which Denny, again, a great article. I was just floored by how this author, Adam Gopnik, is that it? Adam Gopnik? I'd never heard of him. Apparently has written for the New Yorker for many, many years. But he just does this wonderful introduction to Paul, claiming that, Paul is really one of the most important people that we can rely on for the foundation of Western civilization. But why I found this article so important is that he introduces us to at least two new books about Paul, one of them written by Paula Fredrickson, whom we know, on Paul among the pagans. And that contains a it's a collection of articles, a collection of essays by Pauline scholars, and it contains a one essay entitled "Paul Among Pagan Penises," which is probably worth worth the price of the book in itself. Um, but what I really liked, there was another scholar that Gopnik introduced us to by the name of Nina Livesey, who teaches at the University of Oklahoma. And I looked her up, and she is actually now she's in her 70s, so I'm hoping she's getting close to retirement because I don't know if I'd want to be teaching anything biblical at the University of Oklahoma these days. But she has a very interesting thesis that relates to Marcion. She claims, and uh, Gopnik, our author, as well as Paula Fredrickson and her collection of authors, take her to task on this. But nevertheless, she claims that Paul is actually a creation of Marcion, that Paul's letters, his epistles, were written for the purpose of, upholding and establishing Marcion's theology. Marcion was deemed a heretic right from the start. It was very clear that he was really denying any kind of Jewish background to the Jesus movement whatsoever. In fact, you might say he was anti-Semitic for the time. He regarded Jews as completely those devoted to a false god. And we know about Marcion primarily from Irenaeus, who was his contemporary, writing a book called Adverse Heresies, or Against Heresies. And Marcion had this really interesting view of the world. First of all, try to imagine this. I used to, when I was in seminary in Michigan, it was commonplace for a lot of people in the church to say, we're New Testament Christians. And that, can you imagine what does that mean exactly? We're New Testament Christians. Well, they basically were saying that they really don't have much interest in the Old Testament. They see that as superseded by Christianity. Therefore, at the grave, you don't need to be reading anything from the Psalms. You need to be reading something from, the New Testament. This is Marcion. Basically, Marcion said that the New Testament and the coming of Christ was the beginning of an entirely new and an entirely valid and legitimate religion that was setting aright the mistakes of the past. Right? He actually posits what we might call a qualitative dualism, that the world of matter and the world of the Jews, everything that had to do with the past was a stumbling block to the true religion that was brought by Christ. In fact, there were two gods, and our ignorance leads us to believe that the God of the Old Testament was the true God. But Marcion says, no, you're wrong about that. Jesus came to reveal a new God that had hitherto been, that people had hitherto been unaware of, right? So he has a really interesting cosmogony of the way the world was created. Now, first of all, are there any questions about Marcion here? He is perhaps responsible also for the initiation of the idea of having a closed canon, because he had for himself his own canon of scripture that he regarded as legitimate. And it looked like this. This is the so-called Marcionite canon, the first closed canon that was proposed. And this would have been 144 of the Common Era. First of all, he had one gospel, and it was called the Gospel of Marcion, which had a lot of similarities with Luke. Now, you can imagine why Luke would be chosen, because Luke was a Gentile. The other three Gospels were written from a very Jewish perspective. So the Gospel of Marcion was not Luke per se, but it was heavily influenced by Luke. And actually, this is still available for people to read if you ever want to do that. There were no Acts of the Apostles in this canon. So though Luke's gospel was legit, apparently the Acts of the Apostles were fabrications or not seen as divinely inspired. And then Marcion has a list of letters of Paul called the Apostolicon. And interestingly, all but one of these, if I'm not mistaken, all but one of these are recognized today in the 20th and 21st century as the authentic letters of Paul. Uh, Letters not in this list, like Ephesians and First Timothy and Second Timothy, are today regarded as pseudo-Pauline or Deutero-Pauline, written in the tradition of Paul, but not by Paul himself. So it is curious that Marcion hits upon this collection of letters of Paul, all of them regarded as authentic today, but one. There's Galatians, which is regarded as authentic, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, First and Second Thessalonians. Well, I guess Second Thessalonians is in there too. That's regarded as Deutero-Pauline. Then a letter called Laodiceans, a letter to the people of Laodicea, which we don't have access to. Well, I'm not sure of that, but I'm not familiar with it today. Paul's letter to the Colossians, then Philippians and Philemon. There are no Catholic epistles, First, Second Peter, First and Second John, and there is no Apocalypse. So this is what Marcion proposed as the legitimate Bible for his day. And he had a whole cosmology that was really important. And it goes back to Plato. You might remember in the Timaeus, when it came to creating the world, there was something called a demiurge. And the demiurge just kind of comes out of nowhere in this dialogue called the Timaeus. And in the creation of the world, he takes formless matter and he fashions it according to the blueprints of the forms that are the transcendent forms or the ideas that we know about Plato. Therefore, we can look at this world and we can see something, an inadequate reflection of the forms, but we can't understand the forms themselves. The material world in Timaeus is keeping us from understanding the true forms. Well, this is the foundation for what Marcion wants to say about when we read the Old Testament and the New Testament. When we read the Old Testament, what we're seeing is the demiurge. We're seeing a God who created, but a God who created out of ignorance, a God whose creation cannot reveal to us anything of the true God. This God's name is Yahweh. All right, I'll let that settle in, okay? The God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, is a secondary God who was actually a creation of the higher God we might call the One. Try to imagine, if you will, the story that we know about God creating the angels, and one of the angels falls, that being Lucifer. This would have been about the second century, would have been about the time that these kinds of narratives were being discussed. And so with Marcion, in the beginning, there was the one who was unbegotten, who had no beginning, and he emanated these various archons or, forms, you might say. And all of them were reflections of the one in some way. Think about Neoplatonic intellect, the ideas. But one of those archons decides that he wants to be like the true God, and he creates the world and rules over it like like an autocrat. I don't know where we can find an example of that today, but imagine an autocrat who's ruling the world, with an iron fist and demands that everybody show loyalty to him and demands that, he be praised for everything. That's Yahweh, according to Marcion. So he really sets this dichotomy up between the New Testament, which works on the law of grace, the law of love that is original to the one, the high God. And then the Old Testament God, Yahweh, the impetuous child who creates laws and rules for everybody to follow and gets really upset when nobody follows him. He's jealous, he's everything that you don't want a God to be, right? You can see how this presents itself in a very logical fashion, right? Marcion rejects Yahweh and by association rejects the Judaism that worships Yahweh as well. And very much like Valentinus, he rejects the idea that Jesus came in a human body to bring this knowledge. Jesus came in a body that only appeared to be human. It was a supernatural body. This was deemed heretical right from the start. And you can see if you kind of take the bare outlines of this narrative and keep them in mind while you reread or read again for the first time the Genesis creation account, beginning in Genesis 2, going all the way through chapter 3, where Adam and Eve fall from grace, you can see that the story kind of makes sense that Marcion is proposing. And that's what I'd like to do here is read some of these Gnostic texts from the Marcion perspective and see if we can understand why this was such an attractive alternative to the Orthodox Christianity that was being proposed by Irenaeus and Tertullian and the others. So, questions?
I can't quite wrap my mind around the demiurge.
Right. Well, I know. I mean, it's so hard for us. And it really, Angie, it takes a suspension of belief, I guess, to say, because you're so, we are so accustomed to the idea that Yahweh is the God who is the God in the beginning. Yahweh is the unbegotten God, right? And he begets Jesus. For the Marcionites, there was a God that was even beyond Yahweh. And Yahweh was a creation of, not even a begetting of, was a creation of that God. And Yahweh, very much like Lucifer, fell from that God's grace and created his own world for himself, where he was going to rule supreme. And he was going to be the tyrant, which was not even a reflection of the true God, who we simply are calling the One. So we have like this little narrative where Yahweh of the Old Testament is evil. Yahweh wants to create little slaves called Adam and Eve who must worship him, who must live in ignorance and continually praise him for his majesty. And Marcion says all of that's the problem. That's not the solution to our redemption, right? I don't know if that helps or not, but maybe as we go on, you will begin to see this kind of through the looking glass perspective that Marcion had. Anybody else feel a little bit confused by how I'm explaining this? I hope not, because it really does. It really is going to challenge you and your orthodoxy when we start reading the creation account or the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. So this brings us to chapter 2 of Pagel's book. And the story that I just told you really brings us to challenge our assumptions about Genesis chapter 2. Now, you will remember that there are two creation accounts in Genesis. The first of these, Genesis chapter 1, was written somewhere probably around the 5th century BCE after the Babylonian captivity, actually 6th century BCE. The second of those is called the Yahwist narrative. The Elohist narrative. Wait, now is it? No, now I can't remember if it's Yahwist or Yellowist. It's the Elohist narrative. And it was written in the 9th century BCE. And it has a lot of affinities with the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the creation accounts, the Enuma Elish that we've seen, and a lot of affinities with some of those Near Eastern creation accounts. But the story goes that God says, let us make man in our image. And thus he makes man in his image, male and female, he creates them, and he places them in the garden. And then, then he makes all of the animals and says to Adam, look, I've made these animals. They're all your friends. They'll keep you company. And after a while, Adam says, they're just not doing it for me. I need something different, And so Adam is put to sleep by God. God takes one of Adam's ribs and creates from him Eve. And Adam wakes up and sees Eve and says, now that's what I'm talking about right there. That's what I need. And lo and behold, God tells Adam and Eve, look, I'm giving you every tree in the garden to eat from, but there's one I would really like you to stay away from. In fact, I'm prohibiting you to stay away from. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For on the day that you eat of it, you will know death. Not necessarily you will die, but you will know, literally, you will know death. Adam and Eve both say, that's great. That's great. Adam is off one day and Eve is alone, naturally. And, you can't leave a woman alone or, hell's going to come of it. And the serpent, who's the wiliest of God's creatures, is in the garden. And he says to Eve, is it really true that you can't eat of any of the trees in the garden? Posing kind of a philosophical question, right? And he says, oh, no, it's just the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that we can't eat from. And the serpent says, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. I understand why God wouldn't want you to do that, because then you'll be just like God himself. Now, hopefully you're beginning to see some aspects of Gnosticism here. Knowledge, eating from the tree of knowledge, will make you like God himself, this theosis idea, right? Well, Eve eats of the apple or eats of the fruit and gives it to Adam, and all hell breaks loose. God is upset. He comes tromping through the garden and he curses Eve, he curses Adam, and he sets up a fiery gate and sword around the tree of life, and casts them out of the garden, the way you would expect an impetuous God to do. This is the story that Marcion is going to reinterpret. And he's going to basically say, the serpent's the good guy. The serpent is the good guy in this. The serpent, throughout ancient Near Eastern mythology, has always been seen as a symbol of wisdom, look at our medical association. It's got two serpents wrapped around a kind of a cross, right? To bring wisdom and to bring life and to bring knowledge and these kinds of things. But in this story, the serpent's a bad guy. Marcion says that the serpent is the one who is a prefiguration of Jesus, who's coming to bring knowledge to an enslaved people, a people who have been created by a false god and have been, chained, you might say, through all kinds of prohibitions to their little garden. And now that they've broken the prohibition, they've been cast out of the garden. But that is the beginning of redemption. Being cast out of the garden is the beginning of redemption, because now they can know good and evil. Now they've been given independent reason to think for themselves. Now they can come to know God. Do you see the reinterpretation of the story? I hope you do, because this is essential to Gnosticism. It's especially essential to Marcion, who says this story of Yahweh is the story of an impetuous, villainous God who wants to create his own little fiefdom with his own little slaves who worship him and tell him how great he is. Sit around the table and The beginning of every executive council meeting, praise him for this, that, and the other thing. They need to break away from that. So it's with this new understanding that we begin chapter 2 of Hegel's text, the Gnostic Gospels, because all of the Gnostic Gospels, in some form or another, are going to have some variation of the story that I just tried to relay to you. How does that make you feel? Tell me, any thoughts on this? Hopefully, I didn't go over it too quickly.
But Dan, I think, it comes across as kind of a modern view, really.
Oh, well, absolutely. It was Kierkegaard who basically, in the 19th century, early 19th century, who basically read this in an existential way, right? This is the breaking out of a kind of a limited consciousness to a new dynamic consciousness, uh, which is the source of our true humanity.
And
So you can read it in an allegorical way. Go ahead.
yeah, and we all think we have an understanding of God at a very essential level, but we can't lose track of the fact that these Old Testament stories, as you rightly call them, and I would emphasize they're stories and they're written by human beings. A lot of people think, well, God wrote this or Moses wrote this. And no, sorry, that's
Yeah,
not the way it works. But so the interpretations change.
right.
And so I don't, going from the view that says there's an Old Testament God and then there's a New Testament God, that's not that radical.
Yeah. And it's not that radical in what way, Mac? I mean, you're obviously saying that some people think that's radical, like Irenaeus thought that was radical, right?
Because
Or,
you have to appreciate the fact that these are written by people,
oh,
and the world changed, and Jesus changed the world as well. And
yeah,
so you can read the book of Ecclesiastes, and there's a God there,
yeah,
and then you read the New Testament, and it's just a different story
right.
for a different time. And so, you know, our concept of Christianity, it's part of the Old Testament, it just evolves.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned the book of Ecclesiastes because remember, I mean, Valentinus is going to have a similar view, but he's not going to see Yahweh as uh, a creator, a vile creator who's separate from the one. Um, he is going to see the serpent as a manifestation of wisdom, who was the first of God's creations in excuse me, in Proverbs chapter 8. I was with him in the very beginning. It was through me that the mountains were made and the oceans were formed and all of this. Valentinus is going to say, look, the serpent is the manifestation of that very wisdom. And this whole process is one of later on, ironically, it was going to be Irenaeus who was going to say that the creation is continuing to happen. It's ongoing. In the beginning, God says, I'm going to create man in my image or our image. In the image and likeness of God, he was created, Adam. Uh, Irenaeus proposed that we were created in the image of God in the beginning, but history has been a progressive movement towards the likeness of God. So this new learning that you're talking about, we have new insights into who God is. Eventually, one day, when we reach that final culmination, that denouement, we will have achieved the likeness of God, and Christ is an important person on that path. created in the image, but moving towards the likeness. Eventually, we will truly be the image and likeness of God. So there is that kind of progressive understanding, even in so-called Orthodox Christianity. Uh, but Marcion really wrangled, he really got Irenaeus's undies in a bundle, right? Because this idea of the wayward creator uh, and the setting aside, really calling Judaism and calling the Old Testament something of a, well, come right down to it. He called it an evil, it was evil. It was a evil in the sense that it could offer nothing of true knowledge. Uh, this was something that Irenaeus and Tertullian and the others were not going to abide. And so it wasn't long before Marcion became public enemy number one. But when we read some of the Gnostic texts that Pagels has given to us in almost a rapid fire succession on pages 29 through 31, we can see in several of the texts that she refers to, and these were all part of the Nag Hammadi library, the hypostasis of the archons. What does that mean? Well, remember in the beginning, you have the one, and the one emanates these various entities that are called variously archons or ideas or various other names. Then there is a text called the On the Origins of the World. Then the secret book of John, or the Apocryphon of John, as it's often referred to, Testimony of Truth, and the Tripartite Tractate. On pages 29 through 31, she draws on those in almost rapid fire succession. I thought it would be interesting for us to just read these since we don't have the text, and she very graciously has offered a pretty good sampling here of what you get in the Nag Hammadi documents. The first of these is and I'm on page 29, the so-called hypostasis of the archons, how it is that entities like Yahweh were emanated from the one. According to this, the hypostases, the creator's vain claim to hold an exclusive monopoly on divine power shows that he is blind. This is the false creator, right? Because of his power and his ignorance and his arrogance, he said, "It is I who am God. There is none other apart from me." This is the false God, right? Yahweh talking. When he had said this, he sinned against the entirety being all of the archons that were created who are founded in the one, the highest God. And a voice came forth from above the realm of absolute power saying, "You are mistaken, Samael," which means God of the blind. So another name for Yahweh, according to this text, is Samael, God of the blind, God of the ignorant, you might say. Then another text discovered in the same codex at Nag Hammadi on the origins of the world. And this is the one where you get a much fuller explication of how the archons come into being. The origin of the world tells us a variant of the same story. He boasted continually, saying to the angels, "I am God, and no other one exists except me." Now we're talking about the false God, right? Samael here. But when he said these things, he sinned against all of the immortal ones. When Faith saw the impiety of the chief ruler, she was angry. She said, "You err, Samael," i.e., blind God, "and enlightened immortal humanity exists before you." Then, further on down, the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John, relates how in his madness, here's the mad creator, the mad scientist, Samael said, "I am God, and there is no other God besides me." Now, look how this uh, draws your attention to the first of the commandments, right? "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me." So this Apocryphon of John is drawing on that assumption and making a little philosophical argument. I'm the only God, he says. I am God, and there's no other God besides me, for he is ignorant of the place from which he had come. Samael is. And when he saw the creation which surrounds him, and the multitudes of angels around him which had come forth from him, he said to them, I am a jealous God, and there is no other God besides me. But by announcing this, he indicated to the angels that another God does exist. For if there were no other one, of whom would he be so jealous? And this is the question that I've often asked students, in the Old Testament class. I mean, when God says, "You shall have no other gods before me," doesn't God Himself acknowledge that there are other gods? Uh, and and this is basically the argument that the Apocryphon of John is making. So these are three Nag Hammadi texts. And then finally, I'll just conclude with this one, and then we'll pick up on page 30 when we come back. But one called the Tripartite Tractate. I'll just begin reading. When these same sources tell the story of the Garden of Eden, they characterize this God as the jealous master whose tyranny, the serpent, often in ancient times a symbol of divine wisdom, taught Adam and Eve to resist. God gave a command to Adam: from every tree you may eat, but from the tree which is in the midst of the paradise, do not eat. For on the day you eat from it, you will surely die. But the serpent was wiser than all the animals that were in paradise, and he persuaded Eve, saying, on that day, when you eat from the tree which is in the midst of paradise, the eyes of your mind will be opened. And Eve obeyed, and she ate, and she also gave to her husband. Now, given this background that we have of the false god, we can see how the serpent is giving Eve the key to a much broader kingdom than the little prison in which they found themselves. Observing that the servant's promise came true, their eyes were opened. But that God's threat of immediate death did not, the Gnostic author argues, goes on to quote God's word from Genesis 3:22. And he adds this editorial comment. We're still reading here from something called the Testimony of Truth. Behold, Adam has become like one of us, knowing evil and good. Then he said, let us cast him out of paradise, lest he take from the tree of life and live forever. But of what sort is this God? First, he envied Adam, that he should eat from the tree of knowledge. Surely he has shown himself to be a malicious envier. So it's exposing God as kind of impetuous is the word that I keep coming back to, a jealous adolescent who wants to hold people in his command and have them worship him alone. And the serpent, who is a descendant of the highest of high gods, comes to bring wisdom to Adam and Eve. And by the same way, Jesus would come to bring wisdom to those in the first century by bringing secret knowledge, Gnostic knowledge. Any comments about this? Well, I feel like I've been on kind of a whirlwind. I'm sorry if I've hit you with way too much here, but
Dan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just saw your image or photo of Paul Tillich.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I was going to ask how far that argument or illustration, was brought into the last 2,000 years into, sort of the modern era.
Well, you're kind of seeing where I'm going to be going with this, because this was going to be something that would be alluded to in a more orthodox way by a lot of the mystics, beginning with people like John Scotus Eriugena, Nicholas of Cusa, all the way Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich. There's a whole strand of Gnostics who are on the margins of orthodoxy, who, for various reasons, cannot be, though people have tried, they cannot be condemned as heretics because they are still holding fast to the apostolic creed, the Apostles' Creed in many ways. They argue there's one God. They argue that Jesus is the bringer of life, but it is just a varied reading of the text. And I would argue it culminates, well, that culminates because that suggests an end, but it leads itself all the way up to Paul Tillich in the 20th century and his existential theology. So, does that answer your question, Denny?
You know, when I began to ask that, like I said, I just noticed your photo of Paul Tillich popping up. I thought, oh, yes.
Right, right. So you can see where I'm going with this. I was hoping to get there today, but it didn't work. So, talk too much. Any other thoughts? Well, wonderful. I hope you have a good, it's supposed to be cooler this week than it was yesterday. And by Saturday, we're supposed to be getting some rain. So we've got that to hope for on this Earth Day. I will see you all soon, I'm sure. And until then, I hope you have a great week.